We welcome to the program Brad White, Executive Director of the Mississippi Department of Transportation. Always good to see you, Mr. Executive Director. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Well, start out by just giving us a brief update on what's going on there at the Department of Transportation. I've certainly seen lots of projects going on across the state, and several, thankfully, that have been completed, thus really improving our routes and our experience on the roads.
Yeah. You know, we were able to start back our capacity program, which are the large projects that people see that increases the efficiency of our roadways, turning 2 lanes into 4 lanes, bypasses, things of that nature. And being able to fund those projects is kind of a breath of new life to the department. It's kind of what we were meant to do, that, and, of course, the rehabilitation and maintenance of our existing system. But just this last commission meeting, we were able to award a contract on I-10 down in Hancock and Harrison County. We're working on Highway 49 again in Harrison County. Moving forward, we're looking at Highway 15 in Tippah County, Highway 19 in Neshoba County, and the list will go on that hopefully over the next year you'll see a repetition of awards that will start on putting those types of contracts underway.
Okay. So help us understand, Brad, where your agency has responsibility from the roads perspective, and which roads are under the purview of the counties and cities. Where does that kind of start and stop?
State highways and interstates are ours.
Okay.
So if anything with a number that's a state route or a U.S. route or an interstate route, that's our responsibility. And most of the time, if it's got some type of a name or a county road number applied to it, that's going to be the county or the municipality that has that. But if it's a interstate highway, a United States highway, or a SR like 13, which are a lot of the 2-lane highways in the state, if it's a state route, that's ours. We have about a $65 billion asset that the taxpayers have of highways and bridges around the state that we have to maintain and rehabilitate to make sure that the system is staying up to par as best we can. And then we have another list of capacity projects, which are identified construction projects that are needed in order to keep the route efficient to handle the traffic.
Okay.
And, that needs list probably exceeds $7 billion at this point.
Okay. I think it's always good to discuss just kind of the economic model of the Department of Transportation, primarily the funding sources. Some federal, some state from our fuel tax.
Yeah, we're a state agency, but really we're a state entity that has to implement a federal program.
Okay.
And so what we run is a reimbursement program of sorts. We have a partnership with the Federal Highway Administration. Congress authorizes them every 5 years and sets what their budget will be in each of the 50 states. We get somewhere in the neighborhood of $3.5 billion of federal money that's made available to us over that 5 years. That's not counting the state funds that we get. We're normally about almost a 50-50 split.
Okay, between federal and
state. And federal. But the way that what we do works is we spend our state money up front doing the maintenance or the construction or whatever the need is at the time, working with the Federal Highway Administration to make sure that we're doing it to their standards and following their regulations, and then they reimburse us whatever federal portion of that money should be.
Okay.
So we try to keep around $160 million in the bank. That's kind of like the water in a river. It's not the same money today that it was yesterday or will be then. Money's constantly flowing out and flowing in.
Sure.
If we're doing things right. And that's how we build and maintain everything that we've done. About 12 years ago, I guess it was, the former commission had to make the decision to stop all of the capacity projects, the bypasses or the 4-laning of highways or other things like that would help the flow of traffic move more efficiently and safely. Because of a funding breakdown that we had, there wasn't enough money there to meet our required maintenance on our existing system, and at the same time try to be forward-thinking in the enhancements that need to be made to the system.
Okay.
And so they put a moratorium of sorts on those types of projects to devote all the money toward the maintenance of our existing system. But thanks to the last reauthorization of federal highway, Mississippi received about $1 billion extra of federal money made available to us over that 5-year period, which allowed us to divert about $115 million a year to those types of projects again to restart them. And the legislature has been extremely helpful in getting engaged in that program as well as the maintenance to try to put state money there, additional state dollars there, that would allow projects that were brought to a point where it was time to award a contract to go on and fund them and get them out of the way to try to get the conveyor belt of projects off and running.
Yeah.
So between the last two sessions, we've received somewhere in the neighborhood of about $800 million from the legislature outside of the fuel tax and federal things to try to help.
But that didn't come out of the general fund, did it?
No, this was a lot of the surplus. It was a lot of the extra money that the state had by virtue of just prosperous times, I guess you'd say, economically.
So it's just a cash transfer, essentially, a balance sheet transaction.
And I think they were smart in how to do it since it was one-time money. They were like, well, we're not going to just put one-time money on a reoccurring expense that we're going to have, but we can put one-time money on a one-time expense and try to get these projects built.
Okay, gotcha.
But, I know sooner or later good times are going to fade away to the point that resources are going to be a little more scarce. And so hopefully we'll begin this next session with a conversation about what does the funding model need to look like to make sure this core function of government is properly funded to deliver to the taxpayers what they need in the way of infrastructure, but do so in a financially responsible way as well.
Gotcha. So what about the next legislative session? What are you going to be talking to them about then?
Well, I asked for three things when I met with the lieutenant governor the other day. They were kind enough 2 years ago to refrain from earmarking our federal program. And the importance of that is, again, playing this reimbursement game or the implementation of the federal program. Our staff does a really good job of managing those different buckets of money that come down from the federal government and making sure that we're maximizing the use of the federal dollars in a way that when left unencumbered, we get to the end of the fiscal year and we have enough money then to ask for additional obligation authority, which results in additional money. Okay. And when the legislature in previous years would earmark that program, it would remove that flexibility. So it would hamper our staff's ability to play the shell game in the most strategic of ways to where we could take advantage of asking for additional obligation authority at the end of the year. 2 years in a row, though, that they've refrained from doing that, we've been able, I believe, to prove that that was a wise decision on their part. And this year we were able to request from the feds and receive another $100 million roughly of obligation authority, which will result in additional federal dollars. Second, I've asked them to keep my authority there to continue adjusting salaries within the department. That was something that hit us in a bad way, and that salaries had not been adjusted in years, and we were losing people. And the importance of that to the taxpayers is those are the positions that when there are potholes or guardrails that need fixing or any type of routine work that you would have from a constituent services standpoint or clogged culvert, anything like that, these are the teams of people that are dispatched around the state to do that work. These are our first responders that when tornadoes are there or hurricanes are there, these are the people that are clearing the roadways so the ambulances and the police and everybody else can get through to the folks that need those services. And when I became director, I think our starting pay was right around $18,000 a year. Well, you can't provide for a family on that. And then on the engineering side, when the 87 four-lane program was passed, a lot of the pre-construction work, the roadway design, the bridge, those types of things, we were able to do it in-house. And we were able to do it at a lot less expensive than some of the consulting firms that you'd have to farm it out to. Now, due to the reduction in staff and the inability to maintain staff, we probably spend $70 million a year on consulting firms to help us do what the department used to do themselves. So paying a competitive wage for us allows us to build a team of people that can do the work in a way that is at a cost savings for the taxpayer, and I believe that we've been able to show that as well over the last 2 years.
Okay.
And then the final one is just reoccurring revenue. One-time money is great to have, but it's no way to run a construction program, especially when your federal model is one of reimbursement like that. And identifying some stream of revenue that we can count on is going to be pivotal in our ability to move forward. And I think that can be accomplished without raising taxes if done right.
Okay. Because, in fact, if you can hang around, we can dig into that a little bit further.
Sure.
We got Executive Director of the Mississippi Department of Transportation, Brad White, in the Element Well Studio. The Element Well Studio is Brad White, Executive Director of the Mississippi Department of Transportation. So You know, the subject, Brad, comes up a lot about increasing the fuel tax. That there's been talk about a ballot measure to do that. It's been discussed extensively in our legislature. Last week, Commissioner Willie Simmons, who's the Central District Transportation Commissioner, was on Mr. Gallo's show, and he, as he typically does, he called for an increase in the fuel tax. Now, it is fair to point out that ours is the second lowest, I believe, in the nation. Only Alaska, last I checked, is behind Mississippi at, what are we, 18.7 cents?
State, yeah.
Is that right? Okay.
Right.
And I think California is almost 70 cents on the other end of the spectrum there. And I think the question that comes up a lot for taxpayers is revenue. I mean, we all agree that we got to have sufficient amount of revenue to ensure that our transportation infrastructure is adequate. If for nothing else, from an economic perspective, it's critical to economic growth. There's always the question, though, is can we make some adjustments in the operating model from an expenditure perspective to produce more, to do more from that agency's vantage point without just defaulting to let's raise taxes?
Right. Well, for 100 years, that's the way our transportation system in the state was funded, was primarily through fuel tax revenue and other adjustments that were made early on. It's been 35 years since they've adjusted it, and I'm sure there's room for conversation as to whether or not that should be considered. But I reject the notion that that's where this conversation should begin. I think that it's government's role and responsibility to fund core functions of government, and to do so, to live within their means, to do so with the money they've got. And I believe that there's revenue there that would allow for the core functions of government to be funded without having to raise people's taxes. And so I think the conversation should start from where within the funding sources that we have now could we find adequate funding that can be a reliable, dedicated stream of revenue to fund this program that we have. And, just to throw out some ideas, I mean, you've got gaming revenue, you've got use tax revenue. Portions of that are already obligated to various things and diverted to fund them, most of which are transportation related, whether it's state aid or to the local governments or highway sinking fund. I don't know why you wouldn't look at some of the unobligated portions of those types of funds before they would go to the general fund and say, well, why don't we look at diverting those funds into these specific purposes to fund this core function of government. And it would generate, I think last year, the unobligated portions of those two funds were close to $300 million, that plugs a pretty big hole. Mm-hmm. Well, there's two things there. One, you've got to have the conversation of how do we fund it, what model we're going to use, how do we generate the fund in a reliable way to do that, and then how do we give it to the department where the taxpayers can be confident that it goes to the projects, that it's spent where it's needed. And so 2 years ago, we had funds created at the Department of Finance and Administration that, as you know, reports to the governor, not to the commission or me or anybody. And there's an MDOT capacity fund there, a paving maintenance fund, a federal match fund that the legislature can send money and has sent money to, that by force of law, 100% of those dollars, when they're drawn down and spent, go to whatever type of construction that account calls for. I'm not allowed, nor is the Transportation Commission allowed, to put a penny of it on a building or a salary or a piece of equipment or a vehicle or anything. So any money that goes there, everyone can be confident that when it's drawn down, it goes to the rehabilitation of a part of our existing system or the building of a new part that's been identified through the criteria of our law. Yeah. And so hopefully I'm hopeful that that's a big step in giving those in the legislature the comfort needed to sit down and say, okay, now we know that we've got a way to get the money to exactly where it needs to go, and we don't have to worry about MDOT doing something else with it. And hopefully we have enough ideas to throw onto the table just to begin a conversation that would say, how can you fund this without us automatically looking at an increase in tax? Now, I would tell you that I think that at the end of the day, there's not going to be an answer that fits into just one round hole. There may be multiple areas that we have to look at to address the various needs that we have, because our world is different now than it was 35 years ago when the fuel tax was last adjusted. Just keep this in mind. 35 years ago when the 87 four-lane program was drafted, or now I guess that's 36 years ago or more, that whole program was identified to only cost $640 million. We just awarded a project in Jackson County for a 10-mile stretch of road that's going to cost $212 million in today's dollars.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the cost of things go up. You can look at our maintenance budget now, and it's flatlined with what we're paying, but the cost of asphalt's higher. The labor force costs higher on the contractor. So the tonnage that we're using is going down.
Yeah.
So there is a need for that, but I do think that there's some conservative, physically responsible ways that the legislature and those of us interested in this can have the conversation about how do we come up with a stream of revenue in a way that we can pay for it out of what we have now.
Makes sense. And we should also point out, Mr. Executive Director, that if you designate these pots of money accordingly by statute in particular, that's subject to audit by the auditor. So that money has to be spent for that express purpose. It can't be spent. And if it is, then there's a problem, obviously, that would result from the audit. So you've got to check there, and that's the only point I want to make. It doesn't end up being a black hole slush fund, which is always a risk. And so I like the idea.
Right. And keep in mind, it still has the interface with our federal program.
Yeah.
So the Federal Highway Administration is still watching how the money's spent to make sure that it's being spent in accordance with their regulations and their standards and their rules.
Makes sense.
So just because it's state money doesn't mean that the commission has the ability to do whatever they want to with it. We still have to build things to a standard that's required by the U.S. government.
Makes sense. And it's similar to the way lottery proceeds are allocated. As you know, we got the first $80 million goes to the State Highway Fund. Legislature never touches it. It doesn't get commingled in the general fund. It's sitting there in the State Highway Fund. And then the commissioners and the Department of Transportation draws down on that from the state treasury.
Exactly right. The commission, when that began, made the decision that they were going to devote 100% of that to the rehabilitation of two-lane highways that, when funds are limited, sometimes can get left aside through our federal program.
Yeah.
And so I think we've rehabilitated, getting close to probably 3,000 miles of two-lane highway around the state that was needed, thanks to that revenue stream. But the way that we're able to program that out is because we know that $80 million is coming every year. So contractors are able to build out because of it. We're able to plan out. You can't run a major construction program on just one-time money.
Yeah.
And so the good news is, though, that everyone under the Capitol Dome has shown, kind of the old saying, they put their money where their mouth is, that they're supportive of infrastructure improvements.
Sure.
But they want it responsibly. They want us to be accountable, which we should. And they want it done in a common sense way, and they want the product delivered to the people as quickly and as efficiently as possible.
Sure.
And the best way for us to be able to do that is with a dedicated, reliable source of income that allows us to plan and allows us to then work that plan.
Okay. So is this something you're going to continue to discuss with the legislature?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. We've got great partners. Senator Branning from Philadelphia, Jennifer Branning, has been just the strongest advocate that you could ever ask for infrastructure.
I would agree.
We look forward to working with Representative Massengill, who was vice chairman of the committee the last 4 years and is one of our leading supporters on the House side. Both the Speaker designee, Jason White, he was in every meeting that I ever had with Speaker Gunn, about our needs, and was always supportive in trying to do it. He'd hold you accountable. He'd want it done in a common sense way, but he was always supportive. And, of course, Governor Hosemann, we talk almost on a weekly basis. It's always on the forefront of his mind and trying to address those infrastructure needs, again, in a way that requires the department to be accountable. So I feel like there's an opportunity there for those types of conversations, and hopefully we can provide, from the department standpoint, enough common sense ideas to at least start the conversation. And then where it goes from there is up to those that have the power of the pen.
What about the massive infrastructure bill passed at the federal level? I think $1.9 trillion, if I'm not mistaken. Do you have a feel for how much of that Mississippi will receive, and is that money starting flowing?
Keep in mind that there was a lot of confusion around that bill, because the part of that bill that was important to MDOT, that was the part of the bill that Senator Wicker was involved in, was the reauthorization of the Federal Highway Administration.
About that, yeah.
So that was $3.5 billion for us, and it was phenomenal. Without it, we would not have been able to meet all the things that we've been able to do. So a lot of the rest of that was fluff, really doesn't deal with the Department of Transportation.
I got you.
But the part that was dealt with the Federal Highway Administration, I don't know what we would have done without it.
Okay.
I mean, it was a really good part, and it was the part that made common sense. Anybody that looked at that portion of the bill would have liked what they saw.
Appreciate you clarifying that for us. Brad White, Executive Director of Mississippi Department of Transportation, has been our guest. Always good to see you. Thanks for coming in. You have a Merry Christmas, a great New Year. I'm sure we'll be seeing you around some more.
Looking forward to it.
Yep. We're coming right back, folks, in the Element Wealth Studio.